Let's check out the raid meta for melee in 10.2 for Amir Drasil, of course, because there are some melee that are S tier, and a little bit of a spoiler, no actual melee specs in the D tier, but going into Mythic from Heroic does change their positioning, and the 4 set does affect their performance as well. So let's check out what we have this week. And we're going to start it off with Arms Warrior. Arms is seemingly doing really good right now in terms of overall progress. I mean, we've seen Revis in the Race World First as well, slapping really hard with Arms, and if you really look at stuff, there's really good performance from Arms for when it comes to, you know, just progressing through the raid. And especially on Farok, it's one of the top DPSers in the last phase of Farok with really good execute. And it kind of trails off when you go to Mythic. I would say it's about A tier Heroic, but once you get to Mythic, it starts to lose out on a lot of other specs. It's still really good on sweeping strikes encounters like Laradar, where you just have the trends spawn every now and again. It seems like you're doing a really good amount of damage with the sweeping strikes, which is, you know, occasional infrequent AoE, just enough time to get your cooldown back on your cleave. And that's kind of it. The new tier set doesn't seem to bring enough power to Arms like it does for other specs, but with that being said, it is B tier, and of course, kind of like a caveat for the rest of the specs and the rest of the video as well, we don't have all of the logs on Mythic Raid. Obviously, the race is still going on, depending on when you watch this. As of recording this, the race is still on, and most people kind of hide their logs for good measure, right? You don't want to give out your strategies, but Arms is definitely used in Mythic progression in the second week of the raid, so it's definitely a good spec, so don't knock it off too quick. And we're gonna go to Assassination. Now, if you have played World of Warcraft in the last couple of weeks, you might know a little thing about Assassination and its rework. It's POG. It's very POG. It's so POG, it's S tier, and likely the best spec in this tier list. We're gonna see there's another S tier contender down the road, but it's just super high consistent damage across the board. Right now, it's the best performing spec on Farok on Heroic. We don't know how this is going to be on Mythic, clearly, because there's no Mythic logs so far, at least for Farok and the last couple of bosses of the raid, but it's just doing really well. It doesn't really have any obvious weaknesses. Obviously, the damage profile is really good for Assassination. It has, you know, historically always been a good raid spec. Just in the last couple of raids, it seems like it trailed off in terms of overall damage performance, but it seems like that's back now, which is great. But on Farok, it seems like it's doing a little bit less than Havoc, which we're gonna get to in a second, even though Assassination is, by all means and measures and criteria, the best spec period in the raid. Not just from melee, by the way, not just from melee, but if you look on either Heroic or Mythic logs, it's number 1 or at the very most number 2, depending on when you watch this. And by watching this, I mean watch our Patreon page. Heyo, we have a Patreon page, of course we do, and it definitely supports these videos and more videos to come. Patreon.com/Marcelian_online. The link is down in the description, and you'll be able to help your boys make more awesome content. Now, you'll also get some goodies in return. First of all, you have early access to some of the videos. You have access to bloopers, which is not... bloopers are a myth. We're professionals here. And also customizable wallpapers with your main that are really dope. Marcelian does a really good job at doing all of those, and you can see them on the screen right now. They're really cool. And if anything, you can just check it out, and maybe it's not for you. But if it is, you're definitely going to be supporting us, and we would be super grateful for it, because we can use that to look at Outlaw. Outlaw is right now turning a lot of heads. I'm gonna first of all put it into A tier because I have a couple of things to say about Outlaw Rogue that maybe most people might not like, at least Outlaw mains. Listen, Outlaw is really good. It's A tier, okay? And it's obviously cranking the numbers. I mean, I played my Outlaw. I'm a dumbass and I still do damage, so I don't know what gives, but Outlaw just brings it. Now, it's just consistently A tier. Sometimes top A tier, sometimes bottom A tier. I predict it could be B tier as we go further into Mythic, because it's starting to trail off behind the other Rogue specs. Now, it definitely starts to trail off behind Subtlety, which Subtlety has been probably the worst Rogue spec going into Amir Drasil. Not anymore, and we're gonna get to that in a second. But overall, Outlaw is just really good. There's nothing really much to say. It's probably the tankiest Rogue spec. It definitely has probably suffers a lot from maintenance because of how the new talent rework works for Outlaw. You kind of don't really want to ever stop doing damage, and you can probably see that in some fights. But with that out of the way, still solid A tier, way better than most other specs. Surprisingly enough, Survival Hunter is also in not D tier, but A tier actually, and this is not something I expected. This is not something that's very obvious to me. Now, it's actually picking up a lot of steam into Mythic, and it definitely has to do a lot with the new tier set, because if you look at some of the heroic performance of Survival, you can see it around C tier-ish. Well, I say C tier. C tier in our tier list, but C tier kind of means below average by a little bit, quite. And that's not the case in Mythic raids. Now, once again, this is not a fully Mythic tier list because we don't have everybody in Mythic. We don't have all of the logs in Mythic. We don't have all of the players in Mythic currently. So the data is as incomplete as it can be. So it's kind of like a cross between Heroic and Mythic. But because the jump is so high from Heroic to Mythic, if you look at the Heroic logs and the Mythic logs as well, I think Survival kind of deserves a spot. Now, will it stay in A tier by the end of this raid tier? I don't know. We're gonna probably revisit this in about a month or two. So we'll see how everything performs. But it's still middle of the pack, and probably the worst sin that Survival commits is that it's not a Beastmaster. Now, we're gonna be moving to Enhancement, which is similar to Outlaw, something that's very hard to talk about, mostly because there's nothing new going on with Enhancement, and that's good because, look, it's A tier. It's still really solid. This has been Enhancement's expansion. Like, I think Enhancement currently is the most consistent high-performing melee DPS spec, period. Obviously, there are a lot of other specs that perform better than Enhancement, but those usually kind of like flop and go up and down, but Enhancement just consistently keeps up to like top A tier, maybe low S tier, but not this time. It doesn't seem like S tier is where it belongs right now. It's very consistent, has very consistent top performance, and it's up there with Havoc and Assassination on fights like Farok. Heroic, of course, because that's, you know, kind of where it counts, I would imagine. Heroic Farok does give you a lot of good gear and a lot of high eye levels, so that's great that it performs well on one of the toughest, if not the end boss of the raid. But that's kind of it about Enhancement. Obviously, it's really good. It got some changes in the talents. The tier set is really nice. The damage is really good. Like, there's nothing else to say that you probably haven't heard of before if you've watched any of our tier list or any Enhancement content out there on the YouTubes. Moving down to Feral, this is also kind of like a surprise, but maybe not really. It's B tier, but B tier means like average, slightly above average. Because I'm also a Druid main, I kind of have a stake into Feral. I am a Boomkin, and I consistently see Feral's out DPSing me on certain fights. It has its moments of shine, let's say. It's still middle of the pack, but it seems to perform more single target than AoE as opposed to Boomkin, and as opposed to what Feral kind of did the rest of the expansions so far, which is actually for raiding that's really good because you do want that boss damage and you do want that single target damage, and it seems like, let's say, like a redeeming factor for Feral is that one of its best bosses is Nimue on Heroic, which is a very tough boss in terms of like the overall damage it's doing, and likely once we get more data on Mythic, we might see something similar as well. And doing good damage on a very tough boss, at least a tough boss to heal, maybe not that mechanically, is really good for Feral, and it's keeping it up there. And most likely, the reason why it's probably not going to make it into A tier is because the performance seems to drop off a little bit in Mythic, even though the tier set is arguably way better than before. Doesn't seem to just give as much damage to Feral as other tier sets give to other classes. That's not the case for Frost DK. Not D tier, but Frost DK is, well, is this really surprising for raids? This is kind of a bummer because we expected really cool things from Frost DK. Obviously, its tier set with Chill Streak is really nice. It doesn't seem to favor single target that much. Obviously, the Chill Streak bounces off of you, so it still does single target damage, not as much as Cleave or AoE, but Frost DK is still really solid. The top contenders right now, unless you're Noogie, which is just a god at DK, are basically using Breath of Sindragosa to do really good damage. If you can maintain high uptime on Breath, you're going to be doing really solid damage. above most people, but you know, not above most people playing the best of the melees with the best of the skills and things like that. It's something to at least keep an eye out for, because once the legendary axe drops in the raid, or at least it's made available in the game, you're definitely not going to be playing Breath of Sindragosa anymore unless the axe is just turbo bad, which I would be super surprised, and you're definitely going to switch to Obliteration. Whatever Frost DK is doing right now, whether it is Heroic, whether it is Mythic, it's definitely not going to be doing the same thing in, I would say, I don't know, a month. I don't know how long it will take for the legendary axe to drop. Most likely we'll know more once the Race World First finishes, and obviously since you won't have breath anymore, you'll change your entire playstyle. So we'll see how that performs going down the road into the end part of Mythic progression. Fury Warrior is also a change up, let's say, because right now if you look at Fury performance, at least in Heroic and part of the majority of people's progression, it's around B tier. But as you go into Mythic, it starts to do a lot better. Probably better than Survival, let's put it there. Definitely A tier in Mythic. It starts to pick up a lot of steam against Arms, which is seemingly has been losing to so far in the race and in the progress and all of that stuff. It's good. It just it's the best warrior DPS spec period going into Mythic, and it's likely going to stay that way because Arms tier set is just underwhelming, let's say, and it just has really solid performance on Farok above most melee, which is probably one of its best fights, and obviously similar to Enhancement, that says a little bit. I am still a little bit conflicted putting it on the same tier as Enhancement. I think its position in the A tier is probably more relevant than most because it's not equal to Enhancement, but I don't think it's B tier either. At least in my personal opinion, looking at the logs, looking at the performance overall, I think it's still a pretty solid DPS spec. If anything, it maybe has more mobility than Enhancement, maybe can have more boss uptime. Probably is definitely tankier than Enhancement, so it has some redeeming features that can keep it close to the same level. But in terms of overall damage, it currently doesn't really hold a candle to Enhancement. Moving to Havoc. We do have a couple of things to say about Havoc, but let's first put it into S tier. And this is probably the most competitive S tier we have seen in a very long time in a tier list. It's definitely S tier in most fights. It's seemingly outperforming Assassination in Farok fights and on very, very few other fights, but overall it's just very solid. It's currently statistically the best melee on Farok on Heroic. And if you look at the top 30, even though Assassination is like the back and forth between these two specs is very apparent, and they do like have like a one-up on each other very, very frequently. If you look at the top 30 DPSers on Heroic Farok, which I don't know if it's gonna stay this way for Mythic, you can see probably a little bit more Havoc than you see Assassination, and even still you see quite a few of both of these, so it's still a very good spec. It might get nerfed, I don't know. You could say the same thing about Assassination, but Assassination isn't. I think Havoc is more consistent than Assassination on fights where Havoc is bad. It's not as bad as Assassination, but it's calling both these two specs on S tier bad is very, very, very silly at this point. But Havoc is really good. The rework did wonders for it. It has really good damage performance. It seems to struggle slightly on I guess fights like Smolderon, but I say struggle and it comes off of like 5th place or something like that, and that's just neither here nor there. Retribution Paladin is kind of like Outlaw and Enhancement, but a tier below. It's still very, very consistent. It's really good. It's kind of hard to mess up with Retribution. Like the fights that it's bad at are not very obvious that Red is bad on those fights. It's just really, really good. Probably because the rotation is very straightforward, very simple, and it's hard to punish it consistently with the rework for Retribution, which probably made it one of the best melee specs in the game. Not in terms of the numbers that it dishes out, but mostly in the fact that mechanics, fight design, of boss uptime and things like that don't affect Red as much, which is why you're probably seeing it very consistent. You can look at Smolderon, for instance, as one of Red's best fights right now, and it's actually doing better than Havoc, which is really cool. Although this might have something to do with the orb pickup that buffs you. I mean, that would kind of be the only reason why I see Red's outperforming Havoc a little bit, but you could probably say that about all DPSers. Now, I don't know if these logs are inflated in any way because, I mean, you never really know, right? but it's just really, really solid. The damage is just a smidge off of A tier, and it doesn't have like, it doesn't seem to have like really cool niche like Arms has, which is why I want to keep it behind Arms a little bit. Arms at least shines in execute phases, and Arms is also a tanky DPS. So when the boss is dying and the raid is kind of like on its last leg, the healers are out of mana, you're just a couple of DPSs short, Arms seems to pull off a little bit ahead of Red. Red doesn't really provide any like redeeming factors outside of obviously its utility kit, which is always really good. But if you're in a competitive raid where you're kind of like killing the boss by the skin of your teeth, you're probably having that Red assigned to use those utility before that happens anyway. But if it doesn't, then you're definitely going to have at least a big value in your raid when it comes to Red, which is still really good. And speaking of really good, Subtlety. Now, this has been expected, I guess. It's top A tier. It's very close to being S tier, but it hasn't been the same last week in Amir Drusil, and it feels like this is just the road of Subtlety. Subtlety always starts okay in the raid, and it just starts to pick up steam. I mean, if you really look at the performance in Heroic, it kind of seems like it's around B tier-ish. And that's not the case for Mythic. It starts to go up and up and up in terms of overall performance. And to kind of give you a sense of how good Subtlety is and how consistent Subtlety is, you can look at one of its worst fights, which is Council, because we all know that Subtlety struggles from low target cleave, since its AoE only picks up in big AoE packs, and it picks up like a motherfucker, man. Or Giga single target, but when it's like either spread cleave or 2 or 3 target, Subtlety doesn't really have a big outshine. And even with that, the whole point is that even with that, it's still performing way above most specs in the game. So that's pretty good for Subtlety. I predict it's probably going to keep rising. I don't know if it's going to be S tier material, maybe. Not in the current state of Assassination and Havoc at the very least. Unholy is going down a bit. This, I don't know what to say. Obviously, one of his Unholy strengths was the fact that it was a really good spec to PI and use augmentation on the beginning parts of the raid fight, because it had a lot of power into Army and Gargoyle, which they have been nerfed, but that power has been shifted towards your 45-second cooldown. We're saying this like a broken record for like a month or so now, which normally it's good for the spec, but it kind of lost its niche. It can keep up with Assassination on Volcross, for instance, which is really good because that's most likely a fight where there's very little movement. I mean, there's quite a bit of movement, but you don't lose uptime on the boss because you just, move around the boss. So that's really good. Plus, I mean, Unholy is still a very solid spec to take, and that's probably why it's kind of keeping it into B tiers, because AMZ is so good. It's so good on progress, man. Fuck. You have no idea. But since it's no longer a PI target and not an augmentation target as well, it seems to have trailed off all the way into B tier, and even with that being said, it's still better than Frost DK. I don't know if it's better than Feral. I have no idea where to put this. At least it might have a better niche than Feral, but Feral just seems to do probably a little bit more boss damage. So they're very equal. I don't know. Maybe they're interchangeable. Not as much for Windwalker, however. Dude, I don't know what's going on with Windwalker, man. Every time we do a raid tier list, Windwalker just loses out. It seems to be slightly better than Frost DK, so I'm going to put it in front of Frost DK in C tier, but it doesn't really have any wow moments, any niche, anything. The top performance, if you look at some of the top fights for Windwalker, the perfect parses keep it as 7th or 8th in the overall DPS rankings in their own respective raids. So Windwalkers that just crush it on the spec, just not... They're just lacking damage. I don't know if it's surprising. It's probably not, and that's probably the same sad story all over again, where just Windwalker probably just needs a rework at this point. I don't know else. Similar to Feral though, which is kind of a good thing, is that Nimue, it's still its best fight, but that doesn't really say much because it's above meta. It's above the average meta on Nimue at the very least. Again, a top fight, but that doesn't really say much, and I am a little bit disappointed on Windwalker's performance. But then again, It's not doing good in Mythic Plus anyway, so I don't know. I'm sorry, Windwalkers, but this is how it is right now. And if you don't believe me, you can definitely check our Mythic Plus melee meta, at least the analysis in the first week, which is definitely showing melees in a different state, although most of the same contenders are still rocking it right now, and you can check it on our video right next to kind of feed off past this raid meta into some melee meta and have some fun. Check it out.